interest in finding reliable history in the Gospels has motivated scholars, and this goes way back to before the turn of the 19th into the 1900s, to develop methodologies by which one can establish a sure base of historical fact within those Gospels. That term criticism simply means an interpretive method, and there have been a number of these that have developed, and they kind of developed historically. That's why they're in order. There are others that have gone on since these major ones I've listed there, and you can look at exploring if you want to go into those. But we're interested in sort of the classic approaches here at first, because the terms are thrown around, and you'll see them in discussions and assumptions about them when you read things about the Gospels in other literature. So let's start at the beginning. Source criticism, the effort to discover previous texts within the Gospels themselves. This involves the Q theory, and Q just means source, and it is defined as material in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. We'll see why that's relevant as we move on through. The key observations, when you first look at the four Gospels, how do we evaluate them? Well, the first thing anyone recognizes is there's three of them are alike, and one of these is not like the others. John is an entity unto itself, but the other three are alike in some easily observable ways, but yet they're different. And but we call them the synoptic Gospels because they look alike. Synoptic. Optic is syn like synonym, and optic like eye. What this theory supposes is that Mark was a primary source for Matthew and Luke. In other words, that Mark was already written and was used by Matthew and Luke when they wrote their Gospels. This is called the priority of Mark. I give you the basic reasons why people come to this conclusion, and this is probably elaborated more in the textbook, but these are the basic ones. I'm trying to boil this down to the most simplest points. Brevity. Mark is far shorter than Matthew and Luke, and we'd expect, given the amount of similarity, that the shorter one is being incorporated into the larger ones, rather than the larger ones being boiled down to shorter. And the relationship is much stronger between Mark and Matthew than Mark and Luke. 97% of Mark is in Matthew. That means if we were to go through and put them right together in columns, we would come out with a word for word. We'd come out with 97% similarity, and you will notice that if you ever read them at the same time. 88% of Mark is in Luke. That's still a very high amount, and it seems higher than just a chance. Matthew and Luke never change Mark's basic of order. Once we begin to the conclusion that Mark is the source for Mark and Luke, then we realize we can see that there is a basic chronological order that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all follow, even though there are within that some changes. Once you observe this also, you see that Mark sometimes says things in a kind of a difficult way, and that when you see them in Matthew and Luke, the same passage, you see that they are smoothed out. That's a key component of the source criticism. The other component of the source criticism is, okay, what about the other material? Well, there's a lot of other material. I think it's 235 verses of Matthew and Luke where they have the same basic thing, but Mark has nothing. This has become a conjecture that perhaps there was another source like Mark, but a Q source called Q, which is primarily a sayings gospel, meaning it's a collection of sayings of Jesus, because lots of this is what that overlap looks like. And this ends up being then the two-document theory, that Matthew and Luke used Q and Mark as a foundation for writing their Gospels, and then they supplemented those with other specific material at their disposal or information at their disposal. The thing about the synoptic, this two-document theory and Q, is that it really doesn't matter whether you believe Q is a historical document or not. It still defines that body of material. In many Gospels, scholars will adopt this theory and use it within their language and discussion of things, whether or not they believe the Q is a literary source or an oral source of some sort. Personally, I think this is a good method to work from, as long as one realizes it's just an interpretive method. There are those who hold to the priority of Matthew, but that is very much a lessening group of people. Moving on very quick to form criticism, tries to separate non-historical from historical by analyzing common forms. Form criticism says, what's before the Gospels? Well, what's before the Gospels probably is oral material, at least, that is traveling around in packages, like parables, where the parables are easy to remember. They have a kind of form, and then they're easy to remember because of the form. Or there are other things called pronouncement sayings, or there's miracle accounts and things like that. And there's a certain truth to that. I don't know that they're written, but they certainly do come. You can see the similarity to the ones that come together. Key names there: Rudolf Bultmann and Martin Debelius. Tradition criticism. This tries to acknowledge the fact that one aspect of the Gospels is that they are written with an audience, and that audience is 30, 40 years after the ministry of Jesus and after the resurrection of Jesus. And that part of the selection process that has to have happened for them is motivated by information or messages that Jesus spoke that would be most relevant to their own day and age in the 60s. And the concerns of people in the 60s. In other words, the selection process would be interpreted by the age in which they're written. And this methodology tries to see material like that has that sort of interpretation that looks towards the current audience of the 60s and not simply telling the historical fact from the beginning. This group of people tend to be very skeptical about the historicity of Jesus, but nonetheless, I think they make a point, because even in the process of preaching this stuff today in the Gospels, we're going to select and we're going to interpret toward our audience, and that tendency probably was there from the beginning. So we got to be able to acknowledge that. Redaction criticism is kind of a breath of fresh air from these other ones, because redaction criticism is the methodology which wants to recognize the individuality of the three Gospels in particular, and looks for little editorial notes, little comments, where the author kind of reveals himself, reveals his own point of view and perspective, and it moves from that into the ability to recognize that the author has sort of theological slant, theological views that can be uncovered when we study the Gospels from the point of view of the actual author, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is a very exciting area because it helps us focus in on the message of the individual Gospel writers. Literary criticism is the last one that I deal with here. And literary criticism is considerably more recent, and is also really takes another approach altogether. It says, okay, enough with trying to discover what we can discover within the little pieces of the Gospels themselves. Let's just throw all that out and look at each Gospel as a whole. And let's recognize that one of the elements that all the Gospels have in common is that they're telling a story. And so this is called literary criticism, or it can also be called narrative criticism. And that the common element of telling a story involves plot and characters, good guys, bad guys, the hero, and so forth. It involves different audiences that are in view. staging and movement and all that kind of thing. The criticism against this, of course, is that a novel is a fictional idea, a fictional form of literature, but the value of it is realizing that these are stories, and using techniques of interpreting them as stories has some real value, and telling them and preaching